Two-Face, The Mysterious Mistress and the Confession. Audio excerpt read by the author. It's almost as if we each have a vampire inside us. Controlling that beast, that dark side, is what fascinates me. Cheryl Lee. Chapter 1. Rendezvous at Love's Truck Stop. Into every generation comes a vampire. Holly Black. On a partly cloudy afternoon on Wednesday, August 15th, two Colorado Bureau of Investigation agents pull off the Bison Highway and into Love's Truck Stop in Hudson, Colorado. Agents Matt Saylor and Greg Zentner scan the trucks in the lot for Luke Epple's silver work truck. Epple, a production foreman at Anadarko Petroleum, is Chris Watts' boss. Epple briefly explains the setup to law enforcement. The GPS coordinates 40.21244 and negative 104.3667 refer to a remote well site on the west side of Well County Road 386. The well site is protected by a barbed wire perimeter, a pair of locked gates on two sides, and an otherwise unremarkable farmland setting. The site, Epple says, is surrounded by wild sagebrush, prairie grass, and cactus. It can be accessed by dirt road through rolling terrain, but if you don't know where you're going, you'll get lost and find yourself trespassing. Perhaps this is why the dairy in the area is called Lost Creek. A convoy of two vehicles, one silver and one black, including Firestone Police Department Commander Bryce Borders and his drone pilot Detective William DeWitt, follow Epple's silver truck onto State Highway 76. If the road from Watts' home on Saratoga Trail outside Frederick to Hudson is a near straight line, as soon as it hits Hudson, the route kinks and twirls upward for 20 miles. Like a ribbon blowing from a fence post. Just outside Roggan, the three-vehicle convoy suddenly turns left and skirts under a pair of concrete tunnels below the highway. Then the sun-scarred road crumbles into a dusty track. As clouds of dust billow up from the rolling tires, on the right side of the road, telephone lines lean over, as if pulled to the ground by unseen magnetic forces. It's that, or the sharp blue sky blasting relentlessly, that is causing the lines to tip over, like tired flowers at the end of a long summer heat wave. Saylor reviews Epple's explanation. They're traveling towards one particular gravel pad of three that Watts visited on Monday morning. Survey 102 is property owned by the state of Colorado. This one, Survey 319, is part of the Survey Ranch. Binion Survey is the owner of the land, while Anadarko is the lessee. Binion Survey was contacted by phone at 1617. He granted the request to search the property and collect evidence. It's a disorientating drive through block 12300 off Well County Road 386. The dirt track at the end of the tar ribbon swivels and swings, dips and darts, the substrate making the car rattle and hum like a pit viper's tail. Finally, the convoy stops at the steel grid and gate leading into Survey 319. The vehicle's shock absorbers bounce as each crosses the black horizontal grate laid into the road by the gate. Sailor cranes his head as they enter Anadarko's leased parcel, but the lie of the land is undulating, making the pad appear slightly submerged in the terrain. As they approach, the noses of the vehicles dip. The tan tanks rise against the horizon, like heavy balloons, glinting slightly. Up close they loom large against the late afternoon sky, and the faint lines of a staircase rising along the side of the battery glistens like a spider web beneath a yellow sun. The convoy spreads slightly as they park side by side. The headlights face away from the tanks. None of the vehicles' faces quite point in the direction of Shannon's grave. Chapter 2. Air Search, Emails, Ground Search. I want a cheeseburger so badly, but I have to be a vampire in a few weeks. Kristen Stewart. Standing at the site, Apple points out the wellhead to the one side of the vehicles and the separator situated off to the far side. The separator resembles a sausage-like horizontal pipe. Its function is to sequestrate oil, gas, water, and sand sediment. The gas is piped to another location, while the oil and water is fed into the two holding tanks. Here, the mixture slowly coalesces into two liquids. The water, which is the heavier of the two liquids, is then pumped into the shallower third tank. At 15:27, Detective DeWitt deploys the drone. For the first few minutes, the fields are bright and clear. A slight breeze lifts over the sweltering land, gaining in strength as the day wears on. Soon the clouds above the site join hands, and the light becomes diffuse. Within a few minutes, while scooting around the south end of the pad, DeWitt's drone picks up what appears to be a blue triangular object beside a large bush. The bush is situated some distance inside an area of wild brush. Visually, from the perspective of the vehicles on the gravel pad, the view of what lies on the other side of it, on the ground, is obscured. DeWitt takes a photo of the object and lands the drone. The men on the scene crowd around the LCD display to examine the image. The object appears to be a sheet, and it appears to have been pressed down. It appears to them as if something is beneath it. Commander Borders and CBI Agent Saylor approach the sheet from the vehicle well site area, that is, the north. The wind is blowing at them from the general direction of the sheet. Saylor reckons they may be able to locate the blanket and or the grave using smell. But there is no smell of decomposition, not to human olfactory senses anyway. Instead, the men sniff the slightly bitter, spicy, almost turpentine smell of flowering sagebrush. Once the officers arrive at the sheet, they're disappointed. It's just a sheet beside a bush, and there's no obvious smell. It's also smaller than they thought. Saylor kneels down, removes his phone from his pocket, and snaps a few pictures of the sheet. Without touching it, he tries to peer under it. The ground appears to be intact. Does he smell anything? Saylor scouts around and moments later spots two black lawn and leaf garbage bags nearby with red drawstrings. According to the hefty brand's packaging details, lawn and leaf bags are designed with extra thick plastic to withstand breakage from heavy loads and sharp objects. They are ideal for collecting leaves, twigs, sticks, and grass clippings. Whether you're tackling spring cleaning, summer mowing, or fall raking, These extra large durable bags provide hefty toughness you can trust. At this point, the small retinue of officers and Epple are at a dead end. They've found a few potentially suspicious objects, but besides that, they're stumped. So Agent Saylor decides to call in for reinforcements. He hails CBI agent Dave Yoakum, a crime scene analyst. Yoakum was also involved in the search of the residence. Saylor and Yoakum exchange images of the sheet. From the emails Yoakum has just sent through, Saylor recognizes the pattern. It's the same pattern as the sheets found in the trash in the Watts kitchen. The tiny squares on the sheet resemble digital aerial shots showing thousands of fracking pads seen from the air. Probable cause. With Yoakum on his way, Saylor heads back through the brush to physically re-examine the sheet. There's nothing underneath the sheet but grass. False alarm? Not quite. He notices dirt patterns, as if the sheet has been dragged along the ground. Saylor also checks inside the garbage bags, but finds them empty. That was Two-Face, The Mysterious Mistress and the Confession. Book 6 was published on March the 3rd, 2019. It was only a few days after the second confession was released, literally about 2 weeks after that. And much of what happened in the second confession from Wisconsin prison didn't make it into this particular book. I remember when the second confession came out, there were a lot of comments on Crime Rocket where people sort of said that, oh, well, I guess your books were wrong, or I guess that you're going to have to change the version or whatever. And certainly when Watts was interviewed for the first time in the prison, that did seem to be a possibility that there were going to be new revelations, and that these revelations were going to either bolster the narrative, support the narrative, or even challenge the narrative. To be honest, I was hoping that the interrogators would mention some of the points made in some of the books, and get Watts's reaction to some of them. And in fact, at some point in that interrogation, they did refer to what he was reading, and he was apparently reading a particular paperback. I can't remember the name of it, but it was about some murder, but the conversation never went from that to anything else. I believe that Watts was aware of the social media circling around the shadows and all that sort of thing, and I think that led to him rejigging his scenario kind of according to that. So in the same way that the agents wanted Watts to during the first confession, when they asked him about Shanann and the children, they kind of led him down the garden path that did Shanann do this. And the idea there wasn't so much from their perspective to implicate Shanann, it was to get him to admit that something had happened. In other words, that they weren't just missing, that he knew that they were dead. And so by him admitting that they were dead, irrespective of how, was nevertheless a kind of a milestone in the interrogation. Once they knew that they were dead, then it became a matter of finding the bodies and retrieving them. And so the chapters I've just read to you now were part of that process. And you can see that a lot of people were stumped. That when they arrived at the scene, they were kind of in the middle of nowhere and they were surrounded by emptiness. And, with the benefit of hindsight, we can look into the scene and say, yeah, well, it's simple. Shanann was buried there and the children were there. But you've got to contextualize the situation. First of all, you've got to drive miles and miles to somewhere you've never been. So you're completely unfamiliar with the landscape. You're also totally unfamiliar with the infrastructure. And you kind of have your hands tied. You as a civilian may not interact with the infrastructure. You may not touch the infrastructure. You may not go. You may not walk onto or open anything without supervision. So any single detective or agent is going to be kind of mystified. Where does one actually start? If one's going to look for bodies, and even if you're going to look inside these containers, what are you going to see? And as it turned out, when they did look in the containers, they didn't see anything. So this whole idea that a lot of people have said that Watts was an idiot and that the case was sort of over immediately. If Watts had not taken the bait in the beginning, if he had not acknowledged that anyone was dead, one can make the case that it may have taken a very long time to find the bodies, and one could even theorized, I think quite sensibly, that it's possible that they would have never found the bodies. And what I mean is, I think one of the sort of fortunate aspects, one of the lucky moves made by law enforcement was the use of the drone on the site. If that hadn't happened, it's possible that they wouldn't have found that sheet. And if they hadn't found the sheet, what would they have found? They would have found empty garbage bags. That in itself may have been a clue, but the point being, when law enforcement arrived at the scene of Survey 319, they didn't necessarily have a clear idea of what they were dealing with or where to look. And even when they found the bedsheet, which was a huge milestone in the case, that didn't tell them very much. They found a bedsheet and then nothing else. The bedsheet, as far as we know, didn't smell, although it may have smelled slightly of excrement. But there's no mention of that in the discovery. What made this particular opening challenging was, once again, to get a lot of information from different players. So from Luke Eppel, from some of the investigators, from the description of the scene, and from what one would know about the scene, and to weave it all together in a seamless narrative. So one needed to look at weather data for that day, and one needed to get quite a few sort of strands of the discovery and then weave it together. And one can see as soon as one does that, the story does sort of come alive. And one does, when you reimagine it, you also get that sense of being kind of lost in the scale of this crime. And that is something that I think is very unappreciated by many following this case, is when you go through the cast of characters, and I did assemble a cast of I think it's 60 law enforcement or something, but the cast of characters in terms of this particular case really runs into hundreds and hundreds of names, and it's incredible how many people form part of the story, from family members to extended family to friends to thrivers to law enforcement to CBI agents, FBI agents, to many police agencies, it wasn't just Frederick, it was also Firestone and several others. And then there's lawyers. Even though there was no court case, there are teams and teams of lawyers. There's the district attorney, there's the deputy district attorney, and there's another district attorney. They are their detectives, and it just goes on and on and on. And for people who think that, and it was easy to think that when the case initially sort of happened, that it was very obvious. And it's obvious Chris Watts committed these crimes. It's obvious that he's guilty, all that kind of thing. That's not really the point. The point is there was a lot more going on besides that. So, for example, huge resources were put into place to investigate this case and tie it up and put it in a drawer and put it to bed and shut it down. The case was very quickly dealt with, and in a record time, in an absolute record time. And that's part of the intrigue of this case. If there are questions about why, and that is a narrative in itself. One could write a book just on dealing with the why. And the why is many layers. There's the short answer that he wanted a life with his new love. But so many couples are in a situation like that, where one of the couple is cheating, and it doesn't end in murder. It doesn't have to end in murder. So that's the beginning of the explanation. There's a lot more involved. If one takes it to the debt situation, that's just one other aspect, but it goes much further than that. There are lots of other couples who cheat and are in debt. That it doesn't end in murder, and that's when you need to take all those things together and say, so in what cases do have other murders happened? And I think if you took the money aside, if you took the money problems aside, the likelihood for murder decreases significantly. If you take the affair out of the equation, the likelihood for murder probably disappears. If you take the pregnancy away, it disappears. So it's all these factors in combination. But even with all these factors in combination, you really need the dynamics of the family that need to play out in a particular way. Where I know people looking in sort of look at it and say, but well, he had so many options. He could have done this, he could have done that. Why didn't he do this? Well, I think he was just a narcissist. That's not the way to understand this. The way to understand it is to look at it from the perspective that it was absolutely inevitable. Almost that Watts was in a situation that he couldn't escape, that he couldn't change, that he couldn't fix, that he couldn't avoid, and that he was trapped and caged, and murder was the only way he could see as a way out. And again, if you're not in that situation, it's easy to project and say, yeah, well, of course he could have gotten a divorce. But you need to put yourself in his shoes, and you need to imagine a confluence of events and circumstances where it begins to feel like that you have no choice. And again, one's not saying what was right at all. One is simply saying this is how he got into a place where he felt like he had no choice. And you can't have that discussion when you are looking at all the sort of factual information. So what I mean is, you can look at all the financial data, you can look at all the information about the mistress, and you can put all of that together, and it's not going to answer the question why. What is going to answer the question why is when you get to know the people, when you get to know their dynamics, when you get to know what is the interaction between Watts and his wife. Was Watts a very introverted and crushed in kind of personality, who would feel increasingly crushed in a situation where there was debt, where his wife was pregnant, where he didn't want her to be pregnant, where he wanted to not be in the marriage anymore. But he was also someone who couldn't confront, someone who was a coward, someone who his whole life was used to sort of taking orders and being quiet. And then in his quietness and in his cowardice, he found he really, really wanted to not be in a particular situation. And he may have run the numbers and felt if he had gone through that, he would have lost the house, he would have lost everything, and he really wanted what he had with Kessinger. And I think that's an aspect that's underestimated. Is we can also look into it and we see a husband and wife that aren't getting along, and we think, so what? They didn't get along. Well, it was a lot more than that. It was a lot more than a husband just not getting along with his wife. It was a husband who felt controlled. His finances were controlled. His fate was controlled. He just felt completely sort of crushed in that particular situation. And this is no condemnation of Shanann. Shanann was a particular personality. She was a controlling kind of person, and in some situations that may have worked, and maybe even at the beginning of their marriage may have worked. But there was a point where it became, I guess, insufferable for him and too controlling for him. And, another argument could be that if he'd never met Kessinger, maybe he would have lived happily ever after with Shanann. I don't buy it, but certainly is a possibility. It is something he said. Again, I don't really believe that he was happy and then just happened to meet Kessinger. But that's the other side of the equation, is that when he met Kessinger, he got to know a different side of himself, and he liked freedom, and he liked just being a little bit more in control of himself. And he liked this idea of another life with someone else who listened to him and who spoke sensibly to him about diet and health and exercise and money, things like that. And Watt said a couple of things that we tend to gloss over. He says a lot of things that aren't true, but every now and then he lets slip a few things. And he said a few things about Kessinger where he said, I've never met anyone in my life like this, and I didn't think that someone like this existed. And what he seems to be saying is that, like his experience of being married, he didn't have a lot of experience with women. He didn't date a lot. He didn't have a lot of girlfriends. So Shanann was basically sum total of his experience of, in a way, the opposite sex. And I guess he was used to the idea of very domineering women in his life, and sort of being told what to do, and just being kind of a secondary citizen, kind of in his own marriage and so on. And with Kessinger, I think he suddenly realized that the world was totally different to how he'd imagined it, and that he could be someone totally different to the way he imagined himself. The things that he liked, someone else liked. Someone else could be interested in him as a person rather than just as a provider or as someone who was obligated. And I think we've all been there. We've all been in that situation where you can be with a person who is very limiting and who puts you in kind of a role, and who almost restricts who you are. And then you can be with a person who seems to bring out the best in you, and who helps you to expand and be yourself and be more of yourself, and who kind of likes you for who you are, doesn't dislike you for who you are. So, the sixth narrative extended this sort of horizon in terms of the dynamics that we knew, especially in terms of Kessinger, a great deal. And I think a big part of what's missing from a lot of the debates around this case is what Kessinger felt towards Chris Watts. There are a lot of people who just dismiss him and her as sort of monsters and as pariahs of society, but they don't realize that until the murders, they were, and obviously in a scenario where someone's married and pregnant, it's disgusting to have an affair and all that kind of thing. But if we want to understand this case, one also needs to look sensitively at the dynamics of all the relationships, but that includes not just Watts' relationship with Kessinger, but Kessinger's with Watts. The fact that she fell in love with him, and obviously we can look with the benefit of hindsight and say, well, she made a mistake, or love is blind, or she was in love with a crazy man. But at the time she was in love with him, she really liked him. Not only did he feel listened to her, she felt listened to by him. He was someone who fixed things for her. He was someone who was very much kind of at her beck and call, and it seemed like she wanted someone like that, someone who would listen to her, but also who had some kind of sense of self. I have to say, in writing this particular book, I really struggled with transcribing some of Kessinger's statements. I can't put it any other way than to say that they were very messy in terms of how they were, how Kessinger seems to speak. It just sort of jumps around a lot, and it was difficult to find or even to weave narratives out of this very kind of patchy way of talking about things. It would literally jump around all over the place, and if one just took sort of blocks of the interviews with her, it just was very random and all over the place. So it was very difficult to convert what Kessinger was saying into a narrative. Not impossible, but difficult. Certainly there were patches where there was illumination and there was some revelation. And over the course of her discussions with Agent Zentner, she seemed to become more relaxed, and the way that she spoke seemed to be more kind of in sort of a line, if I can put it that way, where you'd have kind of a narrative. But right in the beginning, it just seemed very all over the place. I don't know whether that was nerves or intentional, if Kessinger was just closed and sort of reluctant and maybe even suspicious, not trying to give away too much information. I don't know if that's the case, but after Chris Watts was arrested, she certainly seemed to be more forthcoming. And what was sort of interesting is she was forthcoming in certain areas, and then not so in others, and then later on in others. And that was difficult to piece together eventually, but eventually when you spend enough time with the audio, you do start to get a sense of patterns. I think one of the most interesting little conversations is where Zentner presents a scenario to Kessinger, where he says basically what everyone is thinking, and pretty much what I think Watts was trying to achieve. He basically says, in a scenario where the children are gone, and I think this was an interview on August 16th, so just after the arrest. Zentner basically says, where he has killed his children, where he has killed his wife, this would then allow you guys to be together. And he simply is saying, well, here's a scenario. Can you see that that's true? And at this point, Kessinger's father interjects, and he kind of says her name several times as if to stop her from talking. And he then also um, stops the agent and says, don't say that, it's leading. And the terminology, to say something is leading is lawyer speak. It's the kind of thing that is said in a courtroom. And so the fact that Kessinger's father would sort of interject on so obvious a point does seem to suggest that there's this thing of cooperating with law enforcement in a triple murder investigation, but almost doing so conditionally. We're not going to respond to certain very on the chin questions. We will provide certain information, and it just also adds to the intrigue of the case. Another areas where Kessinger would literally say she would prefer not to provide this information. So, for example, she would specifically say to the law enforcement that she doesn't want them to talk to Jim, and then they would say, well, we can exclude you. You would have an alibi with Jim, if we talk to Jim. And then she would say, yeah, but please don't speak to Jim. If you need anything, I'll give it to you. And then there's also the kind of game that seems to be played in terms of the cell phone data. It seems we know that Kessinger deleted her cell phone data, and she just said, well, she felt embarrassed about the relationship. And there were a lot of probably photos and images to get rid of. One can understand it from the perspective of personal feelings, I guess, but from the perspective of law enforcement, it's less forgivable. In any event, it's quite interesting how law enforcement sort of went along with Kessinger in the sense that even though some of the data was missing, they didn't deal with her aggressively. They sort of almost allowed her to set the pace and allowed her to be as forthcoming as she wanted to be, and to pace herself, to do it according to her pace. One could argue whether that is being too casual, and one could argue that was effective, that thanks to the way that they handled Kessinger, they were able to catch Watts and also prosecute him as effectively as they did. Another aspect, can you imagine if Kessinger had defended Watts, as in testified on his behalf? Things could have been very different. Another sort of reference case is Scott Peterson and Amber Frey. If you take Amber Frey out of that equation, Scott Peterson would likely have gotten away with murder. And it wasn't as if Amber Frey gave very damning evidence. She simply provided a lot of detail about the affair, and this gave people a sense of the character of Scott Peterson, and that horrified people and just showed a totally different side to Scott Peterson. The same applies with Chris Watts. It's largely thanks to Nichol Kessinger that we know this other side to Chris Watts in the way that we do, and I think that's an aspect where she deserves a little bit of credit. So the sixth book is 340 pages long. It really involved a lot of work in terms of transcribing once again. I think it was the narrative after that really starts to hit, where the series really starts to hit its stride, because by then we have all the evidence that we were ultimately really going to get. So And so I don't think it's any coincidence that Two-Face Annihilation, the book that came after this one, which is book 7, is really the highest rated of the series. Annihilation has got, the moment's got 12 reviews, ranked 4.4 out of 5. It's the best in the series because at this stage one had all the information. But I think what's not always appreciated is each book at its time was the best at its time. And when looking in hindsight, you can say, Annihilation was better. Well, part of the mission of True Crime Rocket Science is to provide true crime analysis faster than anyone else and better than anyone else. So it's not just a question of getting it right; it's getting it right first. And even Annihilation took the cues of the first books in terms of it didn't change the scenarios that were presented in the very first book about the stealth attack as soon as Shanann arrived home. That never changed. That wasn't just simply recycling what was known. It was anchoring the evidence and lack of evidence with the psychology of Chris Watts and the identity of Chris Watts as an introvert and as a meticulous sort of guy and as a very clean fellow. Watts is a very OCD about cleaning, and this is one of the cleanest crime scenes we've ever seen, and in a way it doesn't make any sense that an oil worker and a mechanic would be so clean. And that is an aspect. Someone mentioned, is Chris Watts schizophrenic? And there is an aspect about being two-faced and being involved in such a dirty industry in a way, and being so clean that is. I don't like the term schizophrenic, but there's like two faces to that. Just as there's that face of the silver fox and the charming guy, and yet underneath are the homicidal and cowardly impulses, right? And then Oblivion is rated, that's book 8, is rated exactly the same as book 7, also 4.4 out of 5 stars. Again, it's taking the information that was assembled in the first half dozen or so books, and then just fine-tuning it. And again, the scenario that was done in the beginning of the children being murdered first, and the way they were disposed in the tanks, that has held firm through all of the narratives. So unless something significantly changes in terms of the forensic evidence, the series is likely to stay the way it is and will likely stay definitive. And I think that is the true value in the series. Is it was challenging to say we know virtually nothing about this case. There's virtually no evidence. We don't know where the crime scene is. And look at where we stand a year later, with all the information, with all the discovery. We don't kind of have a crime scene like we do in any other case. And I'm talking about, you can take any other case, high profile case, and you can almost put like a police tape and say, well, the crime scene's definitely here and something definitely happened there. In terms of this case, there's no smoking gun for where, for example, Shanann was murdered. There's also no smoking gun for where the children were murdered. And even if you say the children were murdered in the truck, where? Well, where was the truck parked? and I don't believe that's true. I mean, we've seen no data about um, the back seat of the truck and photos of the blankets or whatever. So that's one of the things that makes this case, which again in the beginning seems so intriguing and so sorry, not so intriguing, so simple. Chris Watts is guilty, move on. There's so much known, and yet there is so much that is missing, and that's sort of almost like a two-faced aspect to the investigation, in the sense that you know so much, and yet so much is unknown or hidden or concealed or covered up or missing or one of those. And it's amazing how much we've learned about this case, given how obvious apparently everything was. I think if there's anything that we learn is that nothing is obvious, that there's a lot hiding in plain sight. Thank you for listening. Two-Face, The Mysterious Mistress and the Confession is book 6 in the series. It's been reviewed 16 times with a rating of 4 out of 5. So it's one of the better reviewed of the first 6 books. In terms of some of the reviews, one of them by Sandy Beach, a must read for anyone obsessed with this case or anyone with strong opinions about the Mistress. Nick was able to identify and articulate all the things about NK that made me so uncomfortable when I would listen and re-listen to her in the 7 hours of interviews. Another reviewer points out the suggestion about Kessinger pawning the ring, and so that is definitely discussed in the case. Obviously this book, like most of the others, is available on Kindle. Oblivion is available in paperback, but I would recommend that people, if you have the option, read the Kindle version. One reviewer provided this review, and this is essentially why the Kindle versions have such great value, and this is the review. I like it that there is no detail too small for him, because there's so much to learn from the tiniest details. I like to think his books are the non-fiction of the future, because they are hyperlinked to sources that amplify what he's writing. The fact that he's prolific keeps me a very happy fan. So this review really touches on what I'm trying to, the kind of reader I'm trying to reach. I'm trying to reach the reader that's got high standards and who's very curious and who is kind of very interested in the smallest details. A reader who's very interested in the case and wants the most prescient information ASAP, and that's really what true crime rocket science is trying to satisfy, is that that curiosity for the truth, because there's so much stuff out there that just isn't the truth. It's just nonsense, and you have intelligent people who are simply recycling Chris Watts's version, and so where can one go to get the rocket science? Well, true crime rocket science. I think that's about it. Again, this is the 6th book in the series, and it's the book that deals the most with Nichol Kessinger, and this is the reason why that this particular cover has got sort of a pink a pink background. I hope that those who have strong opinions on Kessinger and on Chris Watts, especially those who think of him as a narcissist and just have a very sort of cardboard cutout sort of version or idea or impression of these people, I hope those people in particular will read this book and get a fuller sense of who they were in terms of their relationship and as people. I think what was done quite well in this book and in the series was documenting the romance. It's easy to just think of it as 5 weeks, but it was day after day, weekend after weekend, where these two people really fell in love with each other. And if there was murder and a nightmare and a family annihilation on the one side of the story, on the other side there was the magic and the fairy tale of new love, and something that certainly on its own felt very real and I guess from Watts' perspective worth murdering for.